University of Delaware, and I'm pleased today to participate in the Oral History Project. We're going to be interviewing Professor Jim Inciardi of the University of Delaware, who has been a colleague and friend of mine for a number of years. Jim, welcome to the Oral History Project.
Thank you.
Would you begin by telling us something about your personal background and the things that influenced your intellectual development and early career?
Frank, that's really a complicated one. I guess there's a lot of things. Ever since I was a kid, I've been interested in crime and deviant behavior, and in the early days, it wasn't an intellectual thing. It was more of a personal experience thing. I come from a Sicilian American background, and they say that, Sicilians from Brooklyn, New York, everybody's got some member of the family who's in the mob. I mean, that's kind of a myth, but it's a myth based somewhat on fact, and that was certainly the case with me. I remember many times going to my grandmother's house, and many of the big figures from the mob would be there. Joe Profaci, Joe Colombo, and a few others. And even though I never saw the criminal side of that group in these family associations, I did hear my parents talking about them, talking about the kinds of things, especially the Profaci family, who were related to us. And as a matter of fact, my father and his father actually built Joe Profaci's house, and he lived next door to them in one section of Brooklyn. When I got a little older, I lived basically in a Italian-Irish neighborhood, and the two groups were constantly fighting each other. And my father was a doctor, so we were a little bit more well-off than other people. And, all the kids in school knew this, and they called me Moneybags. And, 2-3 days a week, I get the crap kicked out of me going home from school. So I ended up hooking up with this guy. His name was Crazy Joey Fingers. And, he was a local young mobster, a local enforcer, and they called him Crazy Joey Fingers because he was missing a few fingers. That, story has it that he himself shot a few of his fingers off to prove a point. I don't know if it was true, but then we know that Gordon Liddy stuck his hand over fire to prove a point. But this guy, Crazy Joey, kind of took me under his wing and taught me how to street fight and protect myself. And then the Irish kids would leave me alone after a while. Then, as I got older and started going to school, part of my life was almost a scene out of that movie, A Bronx Tale. The Bronx Tale was filmed in the section of the Bronx where Fordham University is, where I was a student, and I used to be used as a runner by some of the people in the mob, not running drugs or anything like that, but just messages. And when I saw that movie, which was filmed on Arthur Avenue, and there were some of the same stores I would actually go to. So, I always had a fascination with it, and then as a student at Fordham, I was introduced to John Martin, who we all know as an eminent criminologist, and he started showing me another side of criminology and deviance, and it was probably at that point that I decided that, well, this is something I'd like to look at more seriously. After I finished college, I got a job as a parole officer. Officer with the New York State Division of Parole. I was supposedly the youngest parole officer in the United States, and in fact, many of the people I was supervising really didn't like the idea that they were on parole and they had kids who were older than me, their parole officer. But that's really how I got into it.
Let's go back a moment. What was the influence of your parents? You said your father was a physician, and I happen to know your mother was a newspaper reporter. Were they major figures in your intellectual development?
Not really. I think since both of them were writers that, I must have inherited some of that ability. But my father was an ophthalmologist, and his interest was in medicine, period. I don't think he ever really approved of the kind of work I was doing. He always told me you would get out of a career what you put into it. And I always got the feeling he was dissatisfied that I never followed in his footsteps as a physician. He never said anything, but, you know, I always knew it was there.
And your mother?
My mother, not really. She didn't have any influence at all. She you know, was more concerned with her own health problems, and she was not a well woman. She had all kinds of respiratory problems, so, you know, that seemed to occupy her existence.
Did you ever give any thought into becoming more active in the mob than?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I just had no interest there. I was fascinated by it, and I'm still fascinated by deviance. When I go to a new city, I try and find out where the sleazy part of it is so I can walk the streets and see the street characters. But my interest was always as an observer rather than a participant.
What made you choose Fordham for your undergraduate education?
That was kind of an interesting one because I started out at Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and most people aren't aware of this, but I was expelled after one semester, primarily because I didn't play by the rules. Freshmen back in the 50s in a Catholic institution had to be back in their room by, you know, 10 o'clock at night. Well, I was always back in my room at 10 o'clock at night, but I had to leave at 10:30 because I played drums in a band in a strip joint in downtown Washington. They got wind of that after a while, and back in the 50s, that was enough to expel you from school. So I don't know how it happened, but I came back at the end of the first semester on a Friday, and my father said to me, "You start classes at Fordham on Monday." Now, I didn't even apply to this place. I didn't take an exam, nothing. I've got a feeling some money may have changed hands between my father and the Jesuits, but that's how I got into Fordham.
And speaking of the Jesuits, were they influential in your intellectual and moral development? Very powerful force, as we both know.
Yeah, I think they were very, you know, my colleague and friend Dwayne McBride, who was a criminologist at Andrews University, has always said that he can see the influence of the Jesuit education in the way I write. And he said, and of course I realized it in thinking back, that the kind of intellectual discipline that they impose on you in school shows up in my writing style. You know, I'm very concerned about precision and fine points. You know, I was never an exceptionally good student. In fact, the reason why I did my graduate work at New York University was that I did so poorly on the GREs that I couldn't get in anywhere. But NYU would let anyone in for one semester. And if you maintained a B average, then you could continue in graduate school. So I wasn't a good student, yet this training that the Jesuits gave me seemed to surface later on.
Your interest in crime and criminology, you say, manifested itself when you found a job as a parole officer. Was that a conscious attempt to get that job, or was it just something you stumbled into, like so many of us did our first jobs?
It was a combination of both. I took a New York State Professional Careers exam, and that was one of the positions listed in it. I was 21 years old. I wanted a job, and of course I wanted that job in particular, but I was willing to take just about anything. That was, you know, 1961, I believe. So yeah, it was a conscious decision because I was aware of the fact that they had a special program, not a special program, but an experimental program to develop parole officers through this training process where you would go through every phase of the job, working in a correctional institution, working undercover, working in counseling, working with gifted offenders and retarded offenders, and drug-involved offenders. So I was very much interested in that, and fortunately I was one of the 4 people who was selected.
Mm-hmm. How did you, from that job, how did you become involved in academic criminology and criminal justice? For example, what made you decide to return to graduate school?
Well, as soon as I finished Fordham, graduated from Fordham, and shortly after I started with parole, I started a master's program at New York University. Never really took it very seriously. I would take a course here, I would take a course there. And, you know, this went on for a number of years. As a matter of fact, many years after I finally got my doctorate, Elliot Friedson, who was a medical sociologist and chair of the sociology department at NYU, used to use me as an example of a perennial, ongoing graduate student who could eventually make it, because it took me 11 years to get my doctorate. But I never took it really seriously. I was never really sure what I wanted to do. And then after 7 years as a parole officer and, you know, being shot at a couple of times, I got sick of chasing junkies across rooftops. The final thing that sent me into graduate school, to take it seriously, I had to go up to the parole office in the Bronx, and I knocked on someone's door, and he introduced himself to me, and I introduced myself to him. And he said, "Gee, I know your name from somewhere." And he starts scratching his head, and he says, "Yeah, I went to Columbia University with your father." And I suddenly saw that, you know, he and I were in the same job. He was my father's age, and I saw myself 30 years from now doing the same thing. And at that point, I said, that's it. And that's when I started taking my graduate work more seriously and left parole. Went to the New York State Narcotic Addiction Control Commission as a research assistant, and I believe that was 1968, and I've been in research ever since.
Did you attend classes on a full-time basis at that time at NYU?
I was never a full-time graduate student,
student.
never a full-time student, always part-time, and that's one of the reasons why it took so long.
Mm-hmm. With whom did you work at NYU?
Primarily Richard Quinney, and Richard and I struck off on a good relationship, even though ideologically he and I are at opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, he was then a critical Marxist criminologist, and, you know, I never saw things that way. But we both had an interest in the history of crime, a very strong interest in the history of crime, and particularly the history of crime in New York City. Secondly, I was never a theoretician. And he recognized that my interests were in other areas, and I got the feeling at times that he was so bored with traditional academic sociology and criminology that he found anything unusual refreshing. So the fact that I was going onto the street and I had street experiences and I did all of these kinds of things, he helped me through my graduate career. And he helped me through my written and oral exams, helping me prepare for them, so I wouldn't have to have this focus on, you know, all of the intense sociological theory that everyone else was looking at. And in addition to that, I was never strong in statistical analysis, and that was fine with him. So I was probably the first student in the sociology department at NYU to have a doctoral dissertation where the only numbers were the page numbers.
So while you were doing that is working on your PhD, you were also a researcher.
I was also a researcher for the Narcotic Commission, but I was not doing my doctoral research on drugs. I was doing it on professional thieves. And the way that happened was kind of an interesting story. That goes back to when I was at parole. And I was assigned a parolee. He was known as Crying Phil. And I went to my supervisor and I said, you know, look at this guy's sheet, his rap sheet. He's got over 100 arrests, and this is the first time he's ever done state time. And he only got 3 years. He's got over 100 arrests. And my supervisor said, go read Edwin Sutherland's book, The Professional Thief, and you'll understand Crying Phil. So as criminologists, we all know Sutherland's work and about professional thieves, and Crying Phil was a professional shoplifter. He's a very nice guy, and I would bump into him on the street because he was from the neighborhood in Brooklyn where my parents still lived. And I would bump into him in the street, and we would talk for a minute or two, and about 5 minutes later I'd see him coming down the block, and he'd hand me my watch and my wallet, and one time he got my belt off. He was a nice old character. As a matter of fact, I remember him asking me to arrange for an out-of-state pass so he could spend the winter in Miami at his parents' condo. Now, I said to myself, this guy is in his 60s, so how old must his parents be? But I made contact with the Florida Department of Probation and Parole, and yes, indeed, his parents had a condo in Miami Beach, and yes, indeed, this guy had lived there on occasion, so they assumed supervision of him. And that went on for the 2 years that he was on parole, and Phil and I kind of went our separate ways. And in the early 70s, I relocated to Florida, and I'm at the Dade County Youth Fair watching one of the carnival attractions, and I say to myself, gee, this would be an incredible spot for a pickpocket, because I had learned a lot from Crying Phil, and I go to get my wallet out of my back pocket, and I feel a hand, and I turn around, and there's Crying Phil laughing at me. And it suddenly dawned on me that I had given him a pass to come down to Miami to steal. And then he started explaining. Once he found out I was no longer with parole and I was with the University of Miami, he started telling me about how all of the professional cannons, the professional pickpockets, would come to Miami in the winter to go to the High Life Fronton, the racetracks, the airports, the Orange Bowl, and I used to follow the pickpockets and watch them work. And as you're aware, I have a number of articles in the journals on professional pickpockets, including one called "On the Grift at the Super Bowl," where at Super Bowl 10, which was in Miami, the pickpockets were in there and just stole like crazy.
Tell me about your dissertation then.
Well, as a result of that, I got interested in the history of professional crime. And it was not a study of contemporary professional thieves because there were very few left. But I started looking at some of the work that Sutherland had done and looked at the literature which traced back the culture of professional theft back to Elizabethan England. So it was really my dissertation was really historical sociology, historical criminology, more than anything else. I ultimately had a book based on my dissertation called Careers in Crime, where it had a little bit of contemporary material in there, but for the most part it was historical. I remember every time I was in a new city, I would track down the old bookstores, the antiquarian bookshops, and I amassed a collection of over 100 autobiographies of professional thieves, professional criminals, other types of criminals. And this is where a lot of the material came from.
Mm-hmm. So you struck up this personal relationship with a number of pickpockets in the Miami area?
That was a number of years after. I was about 2-3 years after I had completed my dissertation. Mm-hmm. But not friendships. They used to congregate at the Holiday Inn down in Homestead, Florida, and drive up to Miami to do their work, and then go back to Homestead. I guess they felt that they were safe down there.
I remember the first article of yours I read was about arson. How did you get involved in that?
When I was working on my master's thesis, I had no idea what to do, and one of my co-workers at the Division of Parole suggested, well, you want something unusual, I've got an arsonist on my caseload, and he seems to be, a real strange individual. He's got a whole history of setting fires, so, why don't you see what kind of data the Division of Parole has? So, I went through a series of 1 million approvals to get access to data, and what they sent me was the case files of all of the people who had who were doing time in New York State prisons over the last 10 years for arson. It was a little under 200 cases. So I read all of these cases, and talk about going back in time. I was using McBee key sort cards, if you remember those things. That was my data system. But I came up with a typology of what seemed to be 6 types of fire setters that ended up in state prisons. And after I had written my master's thesis, I wrote this little article on arsonists. And I remember Dan Glazer was my boss at the New York State Narcotic Commission. He was director of research. And I showed him the article, and he kind of, edited it throughout. It started out black and white, and then it was black, white, and red. But he gave me a lot of help, and he suggested that I send it to Criminologica, which ultimately became the journal Criminology with the American Society of Criminology, and that was, I believe, my first article.
How many years did you work for Dan Glazer?
I worked for Dan Glazer only for about a year. He came on as director of research shortly after I arrived at the Narcotic Commission. He only stayed there about a year and left and went to USC, I believe. And that's when Carl Chambers, who had more of a history of drug research. Dan Glazer had a long history of research. Carl Chambers had come from the Addiction Research Center in the Federal Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. His whole focus was substance abuse research, and that's when I started working for Carl, who probably had the greatest influence on my career as a drug researcher.
What kind of research did you do for the New York State Commission?
Initially, I was doing small street studies, small case studies, and then Carl decided he got what was really an innovative idea at that time, 1969 or 1970, but is kind of old hat now. He said to me, organizations like Gallup and a number of these others, they're constantly doing these huge national surveys of attitudes and opinions and other things. He says, that's never been done in the drug field. Why don't we do a general population study, state of New York, whole state general population, to look at drug and alcohol use? Up until that time, this had never been done. So he and I, in conjunction with a professional survey firm, more of an interviewing firm, put together what turned out to be the first study of first household study of drug and alcohol use in the U.S.
So those years, you were there what, two years?
I was there from early 1968 through late 1971.
That was the beginning of your drug research.
That was the beginning of my drug research, yes.
And you moved from that position to Florida.
Yes,
in Miami.
In October 71, because Carl and I started to getting into a lot of difficulty at the Narcotic Commission. We saw ourselves as independent researchers who were looking at important things, finding interesting and important and significant data, and the New York State Narcotic Commission was more of a political structure than anything else, and they did not want the data to be published because it was very negative. What it was showing was that the treatment system they had established had been so pervaded by politics that it was ineffective. They didn't want this data to come out. It ultimately did after we left. So at that time, in 1971, Carl Chambers was approached by a number of people in Washington to establish a division of addiction sciences at the University of Miami School of Medicine. So he and I went down there in 1971 and established that. It's still going on under a different name, but he started something that has become one of the larger drug research centers in the country.
And you were also involved in a private corporation that did drug research in
Yes.
Miami. What was that experience like?
Resource Planning Corporation asked both Carl Chambers and I to come with them. This was at a time when the federal government, the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, which was part of the Nixon White House, was making large amounts of money available to states for drug abuse treatment and prevention. And in order to get these federal funds, they had to come up with a state plan. And part of that state plan was you had to know what the drug problem was in the state. So we were the only ones that had experience in doing that kind of survey research. So Resource Planning Corporation set up a Miami office. Carl became overall vice president of the corporation, and I was head of the Miami office. And we did statewide surveys in 23 states throughout the United States over a period of about 2.5 years. The move was more of a monetary decision on our parts. It was a good opportunity. And the firm, at least the Miami office, ultimately folded because it had all its eggs in one basket. And when Nixon left the White House, the Special Action Office was dissolved, and a number of different agencies were merged, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse started. So all of that was around the time that Resource Planning Corporation closed up, and I left the place and went back to the University of Miami, and that was 1975.
You had a close personal relationship as well as a professional relationship with Carl Chambers, I know. What was that relationship about? What influence did he have on your career?
He taught me how to work hard. It started back at the Narcotic Commission. He came on, I believe, in late '69 or early '70, 1970, and he started bringing people into his office one by one who were in the research division. And now, bear in mind, I was just a low-paid research assistant at the time, and his idea was to fire everybody and bring in his own, because he didn't think anybody there had any value to doing work. And I knew this was coming because people were coming out of his office, white-faced, and I would ask what was going on. So when I get in there, he says, "Who do you think is the best researcher here?" And I said to him, "I am." So he looks at my resume and he says, "You're kidding me." I said, "Hey, you need me. I'm the only one here with street experience," which was the case. I had been with parole for 7 years. I was working on the street. I was in a special narcotic project there, supervising parolees who had histories of drug involvement. So I guess he liked the fact that I was very brazen, and he liked that article I had done on arson because it was non-theoretical and it was describing data, which is the kind of things he liked to see. So he said, "I'll make you a deal. You don't have your doctorate yet. You've got very little research experience. I'll make you assistant director of this whole research division, and I'll do it today. If you give me your word that within a year from now, you will have 12 articles either published or in press on drugs." So, with tongue in cheek, I said, "Yeah." So I moved, like 10 salary grades, in a period of 24 hours, a doubling of salary. So I said to myself, "Hey, you got to do this." So I would stay up day and night, looking at the data and writing articles. And I guess he taught me the Protestant ethic. And I found out at that point that, writing was, I was a terrible writer. But periodically I'd take out my master's thesis and read it just to, develop a little bit more humility, because it was very poor. But it was at that point that I realized that, writing was probably 25% talent and 75% practice. Because the first article I wrote wasn't particularly good, but by the time I got done with that 10 or 12 that he had asked me to do, I was writing fairly well, and it came fairly easy to me.
And then you followed him to Miami.
I followed him to Miami, and when Resource Planning Corporation fell apart, he kind of went off on his own as an independent consultant, and I went back to the University of Miami, heading up a project on acute drug reactions. When the funding for that ran out in 1976, I started looking for a job, and of course that's when I met you, because I applied for a position at the University of Delaware in criminal justice. And I guess you could say at this point, all the rest is history, right?
Well, it's too early to end the interview, so
I realize that.
We'll go on with...
Since they don't know that.
With the evolution of your career. You came to Delaware in '76 as the director of a program in our sociology department devoted to the education of students interested in criminal justice. And you became the director of that program, a job you kept for a number of years until you moved into another administrative position, which we'll talk about a little later. And you've also written a very successful criminal justice textbook, as we both know. How do you feel about criminal justice education? What's your philosophy of criminal justice education?
Well, when I took the position at the University of Delaware, directing the Criminal Justice Division, I knew what criminal justice was, but I had never taught it at that point. And, you know, my teaching career had been very limited up to that point. As a grad student, I had taught criminology at City College of New York. I had also taught criminology and sociology at Washington Square College, which was part of NYU then. They've subsequently changed the name. But, you know, I really didn't know what this criminal justice was all about. And then when I started looking at some of the criminal justice textbooks, I said, well, it's the second half of the criminology course. So I said, gee, I know that. I know what this is all about. And all of this happened in that period between the time I was hired and the time I actually relocated to Delaware, because I knew I had to teach a course in Introduction to Criminal Justice and a course on Introduction to Corrections. So I started looking at the material and realized that with all of my own personal experiences, I said, hey, I can do this. And I think that's why I probably got some good teaching evaluations from the students, because I was able to personalize it and give them personal experience. I also found that criminal justice education was really a good idea. You know, the program at the University of Delaware was more of a liberal arts program, and and being in sociology, that was the natural direction to go. And in teaching, I realized that for the students, a degree in criminal justice had multiple uses. They liked it because it was, well, you know, most of the students really didn't know what they wanted to do with their lives. Some of them saw criminal justice as an opportunity for pre-law. Others saw it as more interesting than, you know, 19th century English history, and they wanted a general liberal arts degree, and they saw criminal justice as a very practical thing that gave them information that they understood and they could use. And I think that's probably why criminal justice programs have proliferated so much, because students get that liberal arts education, yet they also get information that they can use if they want to go into the direction of police or correctional work, if they want to go in the direction of law school, or if they just want to go into those tens of thousands of jobs out there where they need a general liberal arts education. So I think it's a terrific undergraduate background.
Did you make substantive contributions to develop that program at the University of Delaware?
I think I did. The program, when I got there, as you know, was not in great shape, and it had to be reorganized and made more academic. And as you know, it was you and I who helped remodel that program. And one of the interesting things is that it kept getting larger and larger and larger, and we would do all kinds of things to make it more difficult to bring only the better students in, with the hope of making it smaller. And everything we did, it kept getting larger and larger. And it's, I believe now at Delaware, it's one of the larger, probably one of the top 5 in terms of the number of majors in the university.
Yeah, we've consistently had between 500 and 700 majors in criminal justice alone. Yeah. And it's been a very important program in the College of Arts and Science. Tell me a little bit about how you decided to write the textbook that has been so successful. In what, five editions now?
It's in the 5th edition, yeah, with a briefer edition currently in press. But that happened, I was approached at a meeting very similar to this one, a criminal justice conference, and was asked to do a textbook in criminal justice, and I was kind of negative about the idea. And then the editor took me to dinner and sat me down and explained to me all the monetary advantages of doing a textbook if it was successful. She made me an offer I didn't refuse, to use an old Italian expression. So I started writing the book, and I had a devil of a time. I spent 8 months writing the first chapter, and it just wouldn't click. And then, finally I said to myself, well, why don't you write this book the way you teach the course? So that's what I did. And that criminal justice textbook was the course I taught. And then after the book came out and it started to do well, I was finding that I was having a terrible time teaching the course because my whole course was in the textbook I was assigning. And I noticed that my teaching evaluations dropped slightly, and I didn't know what to do. And finally, what I decided to do was not use my own textbook. So at that point, I started using my textbook as my guide to the course, and for the students in my class, which I would fill up that lecture hall with 400 or 500 students because I like teaching to a large class. As a matter of fact, the fire marshal closed the course once because we had exceeded by 100 people the number that were legally allowed to be in there. But once I started going the paperback route and using my textbook as my lecture notes, then I got back on track again because I wasn't saying the very same things that the students were reading.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Despite your success as a criminal justice educator, you're not best known for that. I think you're best known for the fact that you have made so many contributions to research, particularly to drug research. Since 1976, I think roughly speaking, you have received about $20 million in research funds from the federal government, all in the area of drug research. What have some of those projects been about? What kind of research have you specialized in over this long period of time?
In the beginning, I specialized in street research. I had a grant while I was at the University of Miami, but that was a grant that Carl Chambers had gotten from the Special Action Office that I mentioned earlier, and that was on acute drug reactions in a hospital emergency room. But when he and I kind of went our separate ways, professionally at least, we always stayed friends until he died 5 years ago. But I was always comfortable on the street. I used to do street research for him, and it's because of my parole background. I was always comfortable out there. So I decided to make use of my interest in crime and criminology and my ability and my comfort on the street. So I submitted a grant to the National Institute on Drug Abuse to develop a methodology for looking at self-reported crime, going to the streets, beating the bushes for active drug-using criminals, and interviewing them. Up till that point, there had been a few studies of self-reported crime in the literature, but they were always small, and they were with juveniles typically. And I was never trained as an ethnographer, but I knew some ethnographic techniques. So I kind of put together a combination of anthropological research techniques and sociological research techniques and survey research combined with comfort on the street, and literally went to the street and beat the bushes for junkies. and interviewed them about drug-related crime and their criminal histories and their active criminality now and their active drug use. And that's the area I started in. And I did a series of grants, series of projects over about a 12-year period, looking at self-recorded crime among heroin users, and then among specifically women drug users, and then delinquents in Miami. And all of this was in Miami.
Even though you were located
Even though
in
I was
Delaware.
located in Delaware, I never really cut the cord with Miami because I loved Biscayne Bay and the water and the weather. But I kept it going on in Miami because that's where all my contacts were. And the people at the Division of Addiction Sciences at the University of Miami School of Medicine, they were off doing other kinds of things. They were doing prevention work. They were doing school surveys. So we never stepped on each other's toes. My interests were over here. Their interests were over there. So I kept going back to Miami, and after a while, it's like any profession, all kinds of people. So I had gotten to know all kinds of drug users, drug dealers, traffickers, arms merchants, mercenaries, and my interactions with these individuals, kind of opened doors to really see all sides of the drug problem. And I continue that kind of research right up into the 1990s, which is the way I ended up getting into, crack houses, and as many people know, I'm probably one of the few people in this field to actually be arrested in a crack house by DEA. And that was during the course of a study I did, which ended up, a product of that study was that book, Women and Crack Cocaine. But at the same time...
Whoa.
Okay.
Tell us about being arrested in a crack house.
I had been taken to several crack houses. I was doing a study on a contract for the National Institute on Drug Abuse, looking at sex for crack exchanges. And, people accused me of, well, this is sensationalism. And there was a very pragmatic reason for doing this kind of research. Starting in the late 80s, as the AIDS epidemic in the United States was expanding, the Centers for Disease Control noticed that rates of sexually transmitted diseases were increasing dramatically in those parts of cities where crack use was widespread. So I was in a meeting, and we decided from little bits and pieces of information that everybody had picked up that, well, there was a lot of sex or crack exchanges going on in crack houses. So NIDA organized an 8-city study to look at sex or crack exchanges and the impact of these exchanges on sexually transmitted disease and hence the spread of HIV infection. So I was hired by the contractor to do the study in Miami. And that's what brought me into the crack houses, and having known traffickers and dealers in cocaine, that's how I got access initially to some of these crack houses. And there was one particular crack house in North Miami that as I walked in the front door one day, DEA was coming in the back door. And I was very impressed with how they did it. Just like on TV, they create chaos. They go in with their guns and screaming and making noise. It disorients everybody, and probably within 10 seconds, they had everybody spread eagle face down on the floor with a 9mm gun to your head and tying you up, hands behind your back with these plastic disposable handcuffs that they now have. I decided not to say anything. Having so much experience in the field in law enforcement, in fact, I had my University of Miami Medical School ID on my collar because that was my protection in the crack house. Not that I was undercover. I never went undercover. I went in as a public health person trying to find out what was going on. You would usually have to pay money to go in. So anyway, when DEA came in, I took my ID off my jacket and put it in my pocket. I just wanted to go through the process. I ended up spending 5 hours in the Dade County stockade, getting urinated on, vomited on, with 40 other people that were in there. But, eventually they got to me. And since I had no drugs and no weapons, and I seemed to be able to explain that I was who indeed I said I was, I was never booked because there was nothing. I guess DEA could have booked me for being in a disorderly place, but that's not DEA's interest. So they drove me back to my car up in North Miami, and I went about my merry way. It was an interesting experience to be on that side of the bars for once.
Tell us about some of the other research projects that you've directed.
Well, in addition to the street studies, I also have always had an interest in drug abuse treatment and specifically therapeutic communities. And the reason for that was when I was a parole officer, at one point I had a special caseload of supervising all of the drug-involved parolees from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut who were in Daytop Village on Staten Island, which was one of the first therapeutic communities in the U.S. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the groundbreaking projects. And I decided to move into that therapeutic community and go through the process as if I were a client. And it was kind of interesting because here I am, a parole officer, the man, and quote unquote in treatment with me were 25 parolees that I was supervising, and we would end up in therapy groups together. We would end up working together hand in hand. And it was through that process that I got an interest in not only therapeutic communities and specifically, but substance abuse treatment in general. And when money started becoming available in the late 80s for treatment, drug abuse treatment in prisons, I got involved with a number of people seeking funding, first from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and then with the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment in getting funding for programs. And we received, $10, $15 million at the University of Delaware, as you're aware, to establish programs in prison. And in fact, what we did at Delaware was establish the first work release therapeutic community in the United States, probably in the whole world. Therapeutic communities had been around since the late 50s, and of course work release had been around in the correctional field for a number of decades, but no one had ever put the two together. And we put together a 3-stage model of treatment that coincided with an inmate's stages in the correctional system: prison, work release, and then parole. So we have this 3-staged process, and we received funding to evaluate it. In fact, we have funding right now, right through the year 2005, to follow several different cohorts of drug-involved offenders, those in various types of treatment and those with no treatment at all. And this 3-stage process has turned out to be so effective that it's being used as a national model now for other programs in other states in the federal system.
Was it difficult to get the cooperation of the state officials in Delaware?
No, it wasn't. There's this idea out there that prison administrators, aren't interested in rehabilitation, or they don't want to get involved with the researchers. We didn't find that in Delaware at all, and that's probably got to do with the fact that Delaware is a small state, and you can get to know everybody fairly quickly. And it was very easy to convince the correctional system that this would be a good thing, that it would ultimately reduce crime and correctional costs. And from a very pragmatic point of view, we were able to convince the Commissioner of Correction that a therapeutic community in prison was an excellent management tool. You know, we guaranteed him that this would be the cleanest part of the prison, this would be the safest part of the prison, and he could reduce the number of correction officers that had to be there 24 hours a day because the clients would behave themselves. And of course, all of that happened. So Delaware, even though it's a small state, probably on a percentage basis, has more substance abuse treatment in corrections than any other state in the United States. We would get programs started with funding through the National Institute on Drug Abuse and other federal agencies, and without fail now, as the federal funding has run out, the state has picked up the bill. Other states are beginning to do this, whereas the movement in the substance abuse field is to shift away from long-term residential treatment in this era of managed care. In the correctional field, it's going the opposite way because prison administrators are now realizing that, you know, we cannot legislate our way out of a drug problem through mandatory sentencing, and we cannot build our way out of a drug problem by just constantly expanding prison capacity. They're beginning to realize that, you know, you can reduce the problem by treating the symptoms of the situation.
Very briefly, what do you mean by therapeutic community?
Basically, a therapeutic community is a total treatment environment, and the philosophy is that substance abuse and crime are only symptoms of a wider behavioral disorder. In the early years of therapeutic communities, the philosophy was you're a drug user and you're a criminal because you're stupid, you're immature, and you can't face the realities of life as an adult. So we're going to force you to act like an adult, so ultimately you'll think like an adult and feel like an adult, and you won't get involved in all of this deviant behavior. The philosophy has evolved to look at the problems of self-esteem and poor self-image, and, you know, the child's sexual abuse and physical abuse that is so characteristic of so many drug-involved offenders. And what the therapeutic community does, it's a total treatment environment and a family-like atmosphere where the focus is on you and your behavior and bringing about behavioral change and personality change and feeling good about yourself. There are all kinds of therapeutic techniques, you know, psychotherapy, group therapy, individual therapy, learning experiences, and it's a long-term treatment. But I think the correctional field is beginning to realize that the criminal patterns a person develops, a criminal career, evolves over a long period of time. So it takes long-term residential treatment to devolve. It's not rehabilitation. Rehabilitation takes you back to a place where you were. It's habilitation, which is really parenting, you know, a parenting process that never happened in the first place. The pro-social ideas, attitudes, and skills were never developed in the first place, and this is what a therapeutic community does.
You mentioned a moment ago that the programs in Delaware have been successful. How successful?
Well, if you look at the people who go through, we have a no treatment control group, and our follow-up studies have shown that after 18 months in the community, only about 20% of those are drug-free, and this is by not only self-report but by urine tests. If you look at the people who have gone through the three-stage process of therapeutic community treatment, 50% of them are still drug-free, and that's by drug testing and self-report. So after 18 months, 50% still totally clean that's very good data. That's very good data. And there are various different stages in the process. You know, those people who have had only partial treatment, they're still doing better than people who have had no treatment. But the bottom line is length of stay in treatment, and long-term treatment seems to work well. We're also finding that, I believe, of those who have had in the no treatment comparison group, something like 50% of them are arrest-free after 18 months, whereas over 70% of those who have had the treatment are arrest-free after 18 months. And that many people not going back to drugs and not being rearrested is a tremendous cost savings, not only to the community, but to the correctional system and the whole criminal justice system.
How in the world did you manage to get funding through 2005 to follow this cohort?
After we did the first 5-year study, we were refunded for another 5 years to continue the follow-up, which brought us through 1999. And the project officers at the National Institute on Drug Abuse submitted my name to the National Council on Drug Abuse for a 5-year merit award to continue the work. And because of the significance of the work and what it seemed to be showing, and I guess it had to do also with some of the prior work I had done. And the idea of the merit award is to eliminate the need for me to continue my work, but need for me to go through that whole grant writing and funding process. So they're giving me an additional 5 years starting in late 1999 to continue the work I was doing at approximately the same budgetary level that the previous 5 years will have been.
That's quite an honor.
Yeah, I was very happy to get that.
You left the directorship of the criminal justice program in, what, 1989?
Yes.
Or 1990?
Somewhere around there.
And started the Center for Drug and Alcohol Studies at the University of Delaware.
Yes.
And now that has developed into a very dynamic unit employing, what, 20, 22, 23 full-time people?
Something like that, yeah, doing follow-up studies and treatment evaluation and prevention studies. Most of our funding comes from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, but we've been doing some work under state contracts. And as you know, we have also moved now into the area of AIDS and AIDS prevention. And we've got quite a significant database on rates of HIV infection and HIV risk behaviors among drug users. And as a result of my interest in AIDS, I also have a project in Rio de Janeiro.
Doing what?
Looking at AIDS seroprevalence and prevention in the shanty towns and the red light districts in Rio de Janeiro. Brazil, in terms of the reported cases of AIDS, and I emphasize reported, Brazil is the number 2 country in the world after the United States. Brazil's blood supply isn't even protected. And because there are so many tropical diseases down there that affect a larger segment of the population than HIV and AIDS, there isn't a great focus put on AIDS in that country, yet the problem is multiplying. So I was able to convince the National Institutes of Health to fund this project in Brazil to do AIDS seroprevalence and prevention in the shanty towns that are on the hills in Rio de Janeiro, and with the long-term process of developing a prevention program that would be useful in other parts of Brazil and other developing nations.
What is the rationale for the United States Department of Public Health funding a project like this in Rio?
Because AIDS is a global problem. AIDS is a global health problem, and what is going on in one country affects every other country in the world. And it's pretty clear that AIDS probably got to Brazil from the United States. You know, if you look at the diffusion of the disease throughout the world, it most likely came from Africa to the United States and then spread from the United States to a number of other countries. But it is clearly a global problem, and our project is focusing on the drug-using population because the funding came from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. But we're also looking at segments of other populations as well.
You've worked then with drug-using populations in the United States and in Brazil. Are there similarities, and what are the differences?
Although there are many cultural differences between the two countries, the the drug problem is basically the same. The attitudes, the values, the reasons, they're all the same as in the United States. The drugs are a little bit different. Brazil is strictly cocaine. There's no heroin down there. Cocaine is the primary drug. But the methods of drug use, the methods of dealing drugs, trafficking drugs, the theft to support habits, the exchanges of sex for drugs, sex for money, and everything else is the same. There's practically no differences. It's just that the price of drugs are cheaper down there.
The ultimate question I'm sure you're asked by many people. You have a 30-year career, at least a 30-year career in doing substance abuse research, drug research. How do you feel about that at this time in terms of the drug problem in the United States and why we have such a drug problem in the United States? What's the etiology of drug use?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. Focusing almost exclusively on drug-involved offenders, we can see things in their early childhood that, affect self-esteem and self-worth that may have an influence on their drug-using careers. The crack epidemic in the United States certainly opened my eyes as to why a lot of people use drugs, at least people in the inner city. When you're living in, number one, a culture of hopelessness, and number two, a culture of violence, crack use is an easy way out because, crack is a very seductive drug. It's very seductive and it's very cheap. And, for someone for whom the educational system, the economic system, the healthcare system, and every other system has failed them, crack comes along, and for a few cents worth of drugs, all of a sudden you're at the top of the world. You're in control, you feel good, you feel important. And, crack was a wonderful thing in that sense. But of course, it's also very seductive and a very destructive drug because those feelings of power, those feelings of euphoria last but 5 to 10 minutes. And once the drug wears off and they begin to crash, the only thing that will relieve it is more crack. So this is why you see so many crack users going on these missions. Mission is a Miami term, and probably in other cities as well, where during the course of 24 to 48 to 72 hours, the crack addict will, just constantly do nothing else but take crack or seek crack until their funds run out or their bodies run out. And it was through this that the sex for crack exchange exchanges took place. And as a matter of fact, if you talk to the street prostitutes in Miami, they'll say, crack gave prostitution a bad name because whereas the prostitute, could get anywhere from, $50 to $75 for a trick, soliciting on the street. In a crack house, you can get a trick for $1 worth of crack. So, crack just changed everything. And when you go to the crack house and the shooting galleries and walk the streets of the inner city and talk to the people in the inner city and hold their hands in hospital emergency rooms or the hands of their families while they're on the gurney suffering from a drug overdose, you begin to realize the naivety and the insanity of the people who feel that legalizing drugs will help the drug problem. And as you know, I have been writing in that area, and I'm very frustrated by the fact that legalizing drugs appeals to so many intellectuals, but it seems to appeal to ones who have never been on the street and have never had any association with the drug problem. Logically, legalizing drugs is a very attractive idea because logically it sounds great. You would decapitalize organized crime, you would make drugs available at a reduced price so people wouldn't have to steal and rob and sell their bodies to get drugs, but of course it wouldn't really work that way because the people who were involved in the street crime and the prostitution, they'd be there anyway because they were there before they even started using drugs. And when you look at how destructive and how seductive drugs like cocaine and crack are, we would have a public health problem of massive proportions if we legalized drugs in this country. But let me get off my soapbox.
All right. I counted your name as author, co-author, editor, or co-editor on 36 books and 196 articles and chapters. What does it take to be so prolific?
Well, it takes surrounding yourself with good people. And having some good connections with some publishers. I got involved in, as you know, I've done a lot of edited books, and I've done that to try and help my colleagues, younger colleagues, get published. Because, let's face it, there is no payoff in editing a lot of books. Edited books certainly don't get you tenure, and you certainly can't change your lifestyle by the royalties you make on an edited book. But I started that when I was at the University of Delaware, trying to help younger faculty, get their name in print. And then an edited book became an opportunity to get some grant findings published and make those available. Make the material available to not only, journal articles are great, but people also like to have a book on their bookshelf. And if the book is on the bookshelf, they refer to it more often than that journal article, which they have to go to the library for. But as you can see from my resume, a lot of those articles are with other people I've been working with. And when you have a lot of people working together on the data and on the article, you can certainly produce so much more. Combined with the fact that when you have access to good, significant data, it's easier to write an article, it's easy to get motivated to write something, and of course, good data tends to be published.
But you've diminished your own contributions to all this, and those of us who know you know that you write a great deal, and you write very rapidly, and you write very well. What are your habits? What are your techniques of writing?
It used to be that I'd get up early in the morning and write all day. I find that I can't do that anymore. Maybe I'm getting older. Maybe I want to spend less time writing. To some extent, I want to get on into other things. But I used to spend an awful lot of time writing, and I think I worked too hard. I want to change that. I'd like to focus now, and as you've probably seen by looking at my resume, my interests are constantly changing. First from street studies, and then into treatment, and now I'm writing more policy and AIDS kinds of things. Where I'll go from here, I'm not really sure. I'd like to do some writing that is less academic oriented, yet I'm still very much interested in the academic end of it, and to some extent I enjoy writing textbooks. So I'll probably continue doing some of the books, but fewer of the articles as the time goes by, and focus on more of the things that I would like to write. If you've seen my book, The War on Drugs, I was not writing that for my peers or the funding agency or anyone else. I was writing that for myself, and maybe because I was writing it for myself, it became a fairly successful book.
Some of your written work about drug use and associated behavior is quite graphic. And whether you're describing sex for drug exchanges in crack houses, or homosexual behavior in gay bathhouses, or transvestitism in Brazil, it's very graphic work. And as you mentioned yourself a few moments ago, some of your critics have called it sensationalism. And you indicated at that moment a few minutes ago that you didn't think it was. What's the value, though, of writing so graphically about these problems?
It's a part of the world that few people see, And it's a major public health problem. And these are the kinds of studies, and I'm certainly not the only one doing them, but these are the kinds of studies that have been able to document a number of the behaviors and settings, the high-risk behaviors and the high-risk settings in which sexually transmitted diseases tend to proliferate. The crack houses, the bathhouses, the shooting galleries, the street corners where drugs for sex exchanges go on, and sex for money exchanges. And only through a study and understanding of these kinds of activities and places can you begin to have any kind of can you develop the kinds of intervention programs, the prevention intervention programs you need to slow the spread of AIDS. And, you know, that's why I'm in this end of the business, not to, you know, write, you know, sensationalist things that about what goes on in crack houses or bathhouses or shooting galleries or on street corners, but to slow the spread of AIDS. It's a horrible disease. I've lost a few friends to AIDS. And so I don't see it as, you know, I've received criticism, you know, from that, but, you know, that doesn't bother me. It's a way of saying, you know, hey, this is real. As a matter of fact, a colleague of mine at the University of Delaware, you know, read an article I wrote called King Rats, Chicken Heads, and I forget the name, but these were slang names for sex, in the sex for crack culture. And she looks at me and says to me, you know, is this real or is this your sexual fantasy? And at that point, I said, okay, here are the tapes and here are the transcripts of the interviews of the women who exchange sex for crack. You decide. And, you know, she ultimately realized that this was a real world. This was the real world. And, you know, she was an academic, is an academic, that had never had any exposure to this part of the world. So she didn't think it was real. Mm-hmm. But only through making it real to people who don't see it can you begin to have an impact. And because of that work, I represented the whole field of sociology and anthropology at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at their AIDS forum, showing those who do the molecular biologists some of the ways that this disease is being transmitted.
Where do you go from here?
I don't know.
What's left undone?
Well, I would like to go back to the street studies. I've been away from them for a while. You know, if we've learned anything about the drug problem in the United States, it's cyclical. There are fads and fashions. Things are constantly shifting and changing. New drugs coming in, new problems emerging, old drugs coming back. And, you know, people constantly reinventing the wheel. And I think it's time to go back and start replicating the early studies for the new populations and new fads, fashions, and trends. Because what we learned years ago doesn't necessarily apply now. You know, we're seeing that the drug users on the street who are committing crimes to support their habits and to support themselves, they're at an incredibly subsistence level, just, you know, barely making it. And so many people are dying out there that I think it's time that we go back and see what has changed, to see how we can intervene and intersect in the problem.
So you think that's what you might be doing in the future?
I think that's probably what I'll be doing, is, you know, personally, I won't be spending the kind of time on the street. You know, I'm getting a little too old for that. But, you know, there are a lot of good people out there who have the skills, who can do it, and I'd like to start doing that again and doing those kinds of studies and bringing to those kinds of studies the new, you know, methods that we've learned over the years. The whole area of street research has advanced tremendously in this era of AIDS with the work of ethnographers, of street ethnographers, and we need, and the use of indigenous outreach workers. And, you know, I'd like to take everything I learned about studies of AIDS and apply that to studies of the drug problem.
After a highly successful career as a researcher and as an academic and as a writer, do you have any regrets? Anything you'd do differently if you had the chance to do it again?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I started out in high school as a musician, as a professional musician, starting when I was 15, and never really pursued that because, you know, my parents never encouraged it. In fact, my father actively discouraged it. I was pretty good. I never would have been. I was never good enough to be, you know, a major star. But, you know, I took to music fairly easily. If I had it all to do over again, I think I would like to do both. And I don't know if that would have been even possible. But, you know, I enjoyed the academic work, the street research, the treatment research. But I would have liked to have pursued a career in jazz as I had started out. So I don't know. Those are the kinds of things that I would do. And I'm headed from here to Miami for my sabbatical. And, you know, I've got my trumpet in the back trunk of the car. I'm going to, you know, reintroduce myself to it. You know, I haven't played it in 30 years or 25 years or something. 25 years, yeah. So try that again.
Thank you very much.
You're quite
I've
welcome.
enjoyed talking with you, and I know our audience will gain a great deal from watching this tape. Thanks.
Great, thanks.